Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Taanit daf Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Meir and Huva Belovsky in loving memory of Meir's father, Yosef Menachem ben Reuven Vishoshana. And today's daf is also sponsored by Rabbi Lee Wax in loving memory of her beloved mother's first Yurtzeit, Myrna Wax, Zichrona Lebracha, Myrna Miriam Bat David Vitzipora. Her stone setting is also today, a woman of strength, courage, wisdom, and love who I miss. May her memory always be for a blessing. Okay, we're going to start our daf. Our daf is basically what we call a daf of Agadatot, which is normally Agadatot can either be sipurim, stories, or which today we're only really going to have one story, but it's more statements of the rabbis about the importance of certain things or the like. So, and then usually they prove it from verses in the Torah. So basically the structure, I'll give you a bit of an overview before we start, which is we're going to start with saying the day that it rains, which is very nice because today it's raining in Israel. It hasn't rained that much this year, so it's very exciting, very apropos. I was preparing last night. I started preparing, and right when I started about Gadol Yom Shamim, I started hearing the rains pouring down right at that moment. So there's the idea that the day that it rains, right now we think of rain, okay, rains, it's nice, it's important, but it has extra significance like certain historic days that happen in history or that may happen in history. We're going to see it compared to three important events in history to say that it's as great as those, okay, which is this way of really, I think the idea of rain is this connector, and we're going to see this further on in the Masechet also. It's a connector between us and God, especially when there's no more prophecy anymore and there's no more temple anymore. The rain is the way that we can connect to God. It's the way of seeing, okay, how are we doing? Checking up on us, right? If we're doing well, then we're going to get rain. So rain is kind of showing, it's a reflection on how well we're doing, and it's our way to connect to God. So therefore it has unique significance. From there, we're going to get off on some tangents, okay? Because we're going to mention a verse, and then that verse, we're going to mention some other drashot about it. We're going to get off on a big tangent about Talmidei Chachamim and how one should learn in a particular way and not in a different way. And if you learn the right way, things will, it's the right way to learn, and there's a not right way to learn, and things, will happen if you don't learn in that way, and we'll see. So that's the second, that's going to be a tangent off of this Gadol Yom Shamim, the day of rain is as great as this. Then we're going to have, and we're going to have a whole bunch of things about learning Torah. And then we're going to go back to Gadol Yom Shamim. And then we're going to get to when does the rain come and when does the rain not come? And on what sins do the rabbis connect the stopping of rain to? We're going to see a slew of statements. The rain doesn't come if we don't do this, and the rain doesn't come if we don't do that, and the rain doesn't come if we don't do this. And number one, that's always the way of the rabbis trying to encourage certain commandments and say, oh, take this seriously. And then you have to question why specifically those and not others. But it was their way of encouraging people, right? This rains come because of this. And again, everything's going to be learned out from a verse in the Torah or the whole Tanakh. With that, let's get started. Oh, and then we're going to finish with, well, if there is no rain, how do we resolve that? Okay, what's the resolution? And there's no rain, and we'll get to that as well. Getting started. Amar Rabbi Avau. So Rabbi Avau says, Gadol Yom Shamim Mitchiyat HaMetim. It's greater than, not even is it equal to, it's greater than, now I said it's going to be a day in history, this is in the future, when the dead are resurrected. How do we know it's greater than that? De'ilu Tchiyat HaMetim L'Tzadikim. Who's going to be resurrected? Only the righteous people. But, and this is a great line about rain, Iluk Shamim, Bein L'Tzadikim, Bein L'Rishayim, right? The rain doesn't decide, oh, I'm going to rain on this person's property and I'm not going to rain on that person's field. It doesn't work like that. If it rains, it goes for everybody, even people who aren't worthy. Upliga de Rabbi Yosef. This statement of Rabbi Avau disagrees with Rabbi Yosef because Rabbi Avau said it's greater than the day of Tchiyat HaMetim. Rabbi Yosef said, Rabbi Yosef, Mitosh shkula k'Tchiyat HaMetim kva'u b'Tchiyat HaMetim. Because it's equal to, it's not better than, it's equal to. So it's not a huge disagreement. They both connected to the resurrection of the dead, but it's a big disagreement because one thinks it's greater than that, and the other thinks it's on the same level. And where does he prove it from? Because he said, and it's how do we know that Rabbi Yosef thought they were equal? Because he says, since it's the same idea, okay, we're going to talk about what's the same idea, because both of them resurrect things that are dead. Like the rain can bring the crops back to life, and resurrection of the dead is bringing dead people back to life. So because it's the same idea and it's equivalent to, therefore, That's why we say the words Mashiv Ruach u'Morid HaGeshem. Now, every time I say it, I think, well, we have to split between the Mashiv Ruach and the Morid HaGeshem, right? But the Morid HaGeshem part, we're saying there because it's like Tchiat HaMetim. Okay, so there you have it. Is it greater than or is it equal to? Either which way, it's definitely up there with resurrection of the dead, which is pretty high up there event. Amar Rav Yehuda, Gadol Yom HaGshamim ki Yom Shenitna Bo Torah. Okay, the day of Gshamim is as great as the day the Torah was received. Where do we get this from? Shene'amar, Parshat Azinu, it says, Ya'arof kamatar likchi. Ben lekach el Torah. Lekach is my teachings. So what does this mean? Ya'arof kamatar likchi. My teachings shall drop like the rain. So here you see, teachings drop. When did the teachings drop? At the day the Torah was given. And they should drop like the rain. So here you see, it's equal. And how do we know lekach is Torah? Because it just says my teachings. What do my teachings mean? Shenemar ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al ta'azov. A very famous pasuk. It appears in our prayer when we put away the Torah. So ki lekach tov natati lachem. I'm giving you a lekach tov torati al ta'azov, which is obviously compared to the Torah. So here we're talking about the Torah. So now, Rav Amar yoter miyom shenitna bo Torah. Again, we have this disagreement. Is it the same or is it greater than? Rava says it's greater than the day the Torah was given. Shene'amal ya'arof kamatar lekchi. He says, let's take that pasuk. What does it say? My teachings are as great, right? Are going to drip down like the rain. Now you're comparing teachings of God, the Torah, to the rain. So what does he say? Mi nitzle b'mi. When you always compare something to something else, you're always comparing katan, hevei omer, katan nitzle b'gadol. You're saying this small thing is like some bigger thing that existed. So if we're saying it's like the rain, that means the rain must be greater than the day the Torah was given. So again, you have the same disagreement here. Is it the same as, or is it greater than? But either which way, we connect it to that. Since we mentioned this verse, Ya'arof kamatar lekchi, we're now going to have a different, as I said, we're going to go into something entirely different. Rava says there's two psukim that contradict each other. Okay, on the sheet today, by the way, I mostly charted it out, and it'll help you kind of see the flow of the Gemara. Rabbi brought two psukim that contradict each other. Ya'arof kamatar lekchi, which is, right, they'll come down to you like rain, my teachings. Uchtiv tizal katalim rati. Right, this is a classic poetic way of saying things, but it's different. Right, they're parallel, but not in the same way. Tizal katal is to come down gently like the dew, as opposed to rain, which comes down hard. So, how do they explain this? Im talmid chacham hagunhu ketal, im lav or feu kematal. If the person who's teaching the Torah is a talmid chacham who's hagun, who's good, okay, now they don't really define what makes a talmid chacham hagun, who does things right, and a talmid chacham who doesn't. But if he's hagun, if he's doing things in the right way, then his teachings are like tal, or like dew, and go, get as many as you can. But im lav, or feu kimatal, you should turn your back to it like the rain. Okay, or feu kimatar, there's many different explanations. Some people say hergeu kimatar, kill him like the rain beats down very hard. Some people say oref, like to show the back of your neck. However we understand it, the idea is stay away from him, don't learn from him. Okay, you don't want to learn from a talmid chacham that's not hagun. Okay, it's interesting that there's a talmid chacham. Right, you think always Talmidei Chachamim are good, but the point is, there's people who learn Torah for the wrong reasons, and stay away from those people. Try not to learn Torah from them. Okay, we'll try to see what these things are. We're going to see right now. Tanya, Haya Rabbi B'Na'a Omer. Okay, I don't know if this is defining what Hagun and Eino Hagun is, but we'll see another distinction. Kol osek b'Torah lishma. If you learn Torah for l'shem Hashem, okay, to basically be connected to God. Torah, there's many ways to understand the Shema. The Shema is right for the right reasons, for the sake of God, we should really say. It basically becomes a drug of life. Okay, we know that drugs, if they're taken in the right way, you're supposed to take them with food, you're supposed to take them X amount of times a day. If you take them in the wrong way, they can be detrimental to your health. So that's why they always compare it to drugs, because drugs can be good and drugs can be bad. So if you do it l'shma, it becomes a samchayim, it brings life. Shenema. Also what we say when we put away the Torah on Shabbat, right? It's a tree of life to those who grasp on it, grasp it. It will also be healing to your navel. So here you see that it's considered something that can heal. Ve'omer ki motzei matzah chayim. Those who find me find life. So here you see it brings life. V'chol ha'osek b'torah shelo lishma. But if you do it not for the sake of God, okay, which we'll see what that means. We're not really going to see what it means, but we'll see. But not for the right reasons. Na'aseh lo sam hamavet. It could be the drug of death. Shneimar ya'arof kamatar likchi ve'ein arifa ela hariga. This is exactly what Debbie wrote in the chat, which is arifa could be cutting, right, breaking the back of your neck, which basically means to cut off your head. How do we know this? This is what we call egla arufa, is when we break the back of the neck of the animal. So we kill it. So basically, it could be the death of you. Okay, now, Tosfot raises a very important question, which in Gefet this week, which is a shiur from Yeshivat Drisha that you can find on our site, find it on the homepage, and there's an icon for Gefet. Tosfot brings up a very important question, which you might be thinking about, which is, what happened to this statement? Kol osek b'torah, right? You should learn Torah shelo lishma, shemitok shelo lishma ba lishma, because you might go for the wrong reasons, but ultimately you'll do it for the right reasons, right? And that get in anyway, even if you're going to do it shelo lishma. So Tosfot has to distinguish to answer this question between shelo lishma and shelo lishma. Okay, there's different levels of shelo lishma. Shelo lishma standard, which you should do anyway, is maybe you're doing it to gain respect for yourself so that people will think highly of you, something like that. As opposed to the shelo lishma in our Gemara, he says, is when you're learning in order to create problems, question people in a not nice way, lekantil, to complain, to say, oh, look, it says in the Torah this, our Torah clearly isn't, right? So it's hard to argue against the Torah if you don't understand the Torah. So you learn it in order to start arguing against the Torah. That's shelo lishma, okay? So you have to say there's different gradations of shelo lishma. That's Tosfot's answer. Obviously, one can, maybe they're like always, we always say, maybe there's different approaches. Maybe some people think that if you're learning to get respect for yourself, you shouldn't be doing that either. And the one who says shelo, we talk shelo lishma, ba lishma, maybe this Gemara doesn't agree with that. It's another way to say it. Okay, so now, Amarle Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Leite Mar Litnin. He says, can you teach me something? Amarle, Rabbi Zera says to him, Chalash libai velo yachilna. I'm sorry, I can't teach you, right? Sometimes I wake up in the morning, I'm tired, right? It's hard to teach stuff. It's very intense, right? So it's hard to teach Gemara. I don't have the energy for it, he says. Lema Mar Milta da Agaditas. He says, fine, you can't teach me Daf Yomi, okay? You can't teach me Gemara. Teach me some Agadita. Teach me, you can't teach me halacha. It's too difficult. And yes, this is the nudnik Rabbi Yirmiyah who likes to, right? You see it here, right? He won't take no for an answer of a Rabbi Yirmiyah, right? You might think could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, right? Sometimes he becomes a little bit annoying, but here he says, listen, fine, you can't teach me that. Teach me something. Teach me a story, a little Agadita. So Amar lehachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So he says, okay, I'll tell you something. This is what Rabbi Yochanan told me. My dichtiv ki ha'adam etz hasadeh. Okay, it says in the Torah, humans are like a tree in the field. So it says, ki b'chi adam etz sadehu. I don't think humans are trees, right? Humans are humans, trees are trees. So what does this mean? Ela mishum dichtiv, but because it says ki mimenu tochal v'oto lo tichlot, it says there in the verses in the Torah about what you can do with fruit trees and what you can do with trees that aren't fruit trees. Fruit trees, you're not allowed to cut down. Okay, that's what it says here. Ki mimenu tochal, you'll eat from the fruit trees, and otolo tichlot, you can't cut them down. Uchtiv, but then it says by non-fruit trees, they're called, let's say, schak, oto tashchit b'chalata. Those you can cut and destroy. Haketzad. So how do we reconcile this? So now he's going to say, well, let's put two and two together. We have Adam Eitz HaSadeh, and then we have two different types of trees, some that can be cut, some that can't be cut. Right, some that you need to eat the fruits from. So haketzad. If he's a great Talmid Chacham and he does things in the right way, learn from him and don't cut him down, right? Keep him. He's a keeper. But if not, you should destroy him and cut him down and don't learn from him at all. We're now going to start a slew of statements. That is all right. I will agree with you, Caroline, that this sounds quite extreme. Okay, again, that's why It's a bit of a question as to how do you define a Talmid she'eino hagun. Could be a Talmid she'eino hagun is someone who's twisting words of Torah to basically say apikorsud or, things that are heretical. I'm assuming that that's what they mean. Otherwise, it doesn't really make so much sense, right? It's not just someone who learns not exactly for the right reasons. That's why you have to go, the extreme direction, which is really what Tosfot does. Or you could understand this as, right, not literal. It doesn't really mean cut him off. It just means stay away from him and try not to learn from him. Okay, now we're moving on to a whole bunch of statements about the importance of learning together. Okay, there's a number of beautiful statements about why better to learn together than to learn by yourself. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, my dechtiv barzel bebarzel yachad. Okay, iron with iron together. Lomar lecha ma barzel ze echad mechaded et chavero. Right, if you put two pieces of iron next to each other, you can sharpen each other. Right, they can each sharpen the other. Right, you take them; they're both blunt, so one can sharpen the other. So two Talmidei Chachamim will learn together, sharpen each other in Torah, right? Because normally if you're learning on your own, you can learn something and okay, move on. But if you're with someone and you explain it in one way and they say, but wait, and then they start asking questions, and then you start thinking about it more, and then you get more in depth, and then you understand it better, so they can sharpen each other with halacha by questioning one against the other. Why is it compared to fire? All my words are like fire. So that means Torah is like fire. Why? You can't build a bonfire with one piece of wood. Likewise, Torah will not be sustained by just learning by yourself. This seems to be indicating something a little bit different, which is by either you won't learn it well enough, or if you just learn by yourself, so you're not passing it on to anyone, right? When there's conversation, you're learning with someone else. We all know also when you learn with someone and you discuss it, you remember it better. And this is what Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina said. My dirtiv cherev el habadim v'no alu. Okay, the sword to the, someone can help me with the translation, the way they translate the simple reading of badim, v'no alu, and they will become foolish. Okay, so what does this mean? To the boasters, okay, sword to the boasters, and they will become foolish. Cherev al sonehem shel talmidei chachamim sheoskin bad bebad b'torah. What they explain is badim, they darshan as bad bebad, alone. Okay, if you're now cherev, so now they say a sword should go to those who are the haters of the talmidei chachamim, which really is a way of saying the talmidei chachamim themselves, who learn on their own. Not only should the sword come upon you, but you actually become less wise. You lose your knowledge. Why? You become fools. And not only that, what's the next step? It doesn't say this in the verse, but the next step is you'll become fools and you will actually sin. How do we get that? Because Ktiv Hacha v'no alu, it says no alu here. Ktiv Hatam, there's another verse that says Asher no alnu v'asher chatanu, which means we became foolish and then we sinned. In other words, becoming foolish is the first step to sinning. So, some people say, no, we can actually learn it from a different verse. V'no alu sarei tzoan v'hidu et Mitzrayim. The officers, the high people, the princes of Tzoan became foolish, and then they caused the Egyptians to go astray. So here you see how foolishness leads to sin. So basically, what do we have here? If you learn by yourself, you're actually, right, not only do you deserve death, the sword, but, right, that sounds pretty harsh. Again, we're getting very harsh language, but sometimes the rabbis use very harsh language to get across a message. And by doing that, right, you'll become fools because you won't understand things properly. And then if you don't understand things properly, you'll ultimately come to sin. Okay, before we had Adam is like an eitz, now we're going to talk about Torah is like a tree. How do we know this? Right? It's a tree of life to those who hold on to it. What happens in a fire? How do you start a bonfire? You start, or any kind of fire, right? You start with small twigs, and then it gets to the bigger ones. So here's a great line. Right? What happens? The younger ones sharpen the older ones, because the younger ones are the ones who ask lots of questions, right? If you talk about Rabbi Yomi on his nitpicky questions, but in the end, right, you ask questions and you get to learn more. Hainu da'amar Rabbi Chanina, harbe, a very famous line, harbe lamadati merabotai, I learned many things from my rabbis, ume chavera yoter merabotai, but from my colleagues I learned even more, ume tamidai yoter mikulan, and from my students more than anyone else, right? And there you have, right, it's everybody's favorite teaching quote, right? How much you learn from your students, and it's so, so true. So now, what's going on here? First of all, I want to just point out, this is not a muvam me'elav statement, as we say. This is not something that obviously the rabbis would say this, because you would think the rabbis were trying to create this hierarchy, and there's the rabbis, and they're at the top, and they're the most important. And we see that in a bunch of stories, when we talked about all those stories in Rosh Hashanah about centralization of authority, and Rabban Gamliel saying, I'm right, you have to listen to me. And on the one hand, they have to create this hierarchical structure. And there were rows, and they sat based on their stature. However, there's this other idea that works together with it. And we're going to talk about the importance of not being arrogant when you're a Talmid Chacham. And they were, I would say, forward thinking and realizing that everybody has what to add. And there's many, many, many studios that talk about this, where, one time something was said in the Beit Midrash by the youngest of everybody, and they brought it in the Gemara. And I always like to say, they have no qualms about saying you can learn from anybody. And that's a really important statement, particularly, I think, in their time to be saying, and when they were trying to create this centralization of authority, but yet they understood that Torah is not all about one person saying this is what it is, but it's a conversation. And there's always more going on. And, you have to listen to other people. And that's really the beauty of learning Torah, and particularly from students and their questions. Okay, so great lines here. Rabbi Chanina bar Papa Ramikti. He says, wait, contradiction from Psukim again, and we're going to talk about this. Likrat sameh hitayu mayim. To someone who's thirsty, bring him water. Uchtiv, a different verse says, hoi kol sameh l'chul mayim. Anyone who's thirsty, go find water yourselves. So either, right, go to someone who's thirsty. Now again, thirsty is for Torah. Someone who wants to learn, either the rabbi's supposed to go to him, or he's supposed to go to the rabbi. So which one? Im talmid hagun hu, again, we're going to have the same split. If he's a good student who's doing it all for the right reasons, likrat sameh hitayu mayim, the teacher should go to him, which is also fascinating to say what the teacher, right, is going to go chase after the students. Yes, the teacher should go to him. V'im lo, and if he's not, then hoi kol sameh l'chul mayim, let him go by himself. This, I think, has something to do with, if you really want to learn, you have to make the effort yourself, right? You have to, and this is if you're coming for the wrong reasons, right? Unless you make the effort, then no one's going to teach you. Rabbi Chanina bar Chami Rami, again, similar split. He says also, contradiction between two psukim. Yafutzu ma'inotecha chutza, your springs will spring forth. Uchtiv yu lecha levadecha. The next verse after this is, they'll be for you alone. Okay, and then it says, this is, and no strangers will be with you. These are verses in Proverbs and Mishlei. So he says, Im talmid hagunhu yafutzu ma'inotecha chutza. This is what we talked about before. If he's the right Talmid Chacham, great, is right. All of his Torah should spring forth from him, and people should learn from him. And if not, then they'll be for you alone. No one's going to learn from you. Why is Torah is compared to water? As it says, anyone who's thirsty, go to water. The water, if you put it in a high place, it goes down to a low place. In other words, try to put it in a high place. What will happen? It will just fall down, right? You put it in a mountain, it'll just drip down. If you try to put Torah in someone who's arrogant, it won't work. It has to go in someone who puts himself down, who's very humble. Why is why are Divrei Torah compared to three drinks, three liquids: water, wine, and milk? Where do we see this? We already know that. Anyone who's thirsty, go drink water. That's Torah. Go get your food. And go get for free. Okay, things that are free are wine and milk. These things you can get for free, meaning, and that's a remez, it's an allusion, they say, to learning Torah. So, lomar lecha, what's this to teach you? Where do you store these things? You can't store them in your silver or gold goblets, they'll get ruined. You have to store them in your earthenware vessels, which are the cheapest of the cheap. Or the ugliest, and most disgusting. Likewise, Torah can only be housed in someone who puts himself low, right? Is humble. Here we get to our story of today's daf. The daughter of the Kesar, of the Caesar, said to Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, which is the famous Rabbi Yoshua, the one we always learn about, okay? The one in the story with Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yoshua. We're now going to learn something else about him. He was very ugly. So she says to him, why is this amazing intelligence that you have housed in a body that's so ugly? Like there's something wrong here. So he says, doesn't your father put your drinks in earthenware vessels? So Amrale, Ela b'may nirme. She says, well, what else should we put it in? Amarla, atun dechashivutu. You are so important. You're prominent people. Ramu b'mane dava b'kasba. You should put it in gold and silver goblets, right? It's not respectful for you to be putting your stuff in earthenware vessels. Azava Amrale lavua. So she goes and tells her father. So what does he do? He listens. He says, Rami alachamar b'mane dava b'kasba utkif. So he puts all the stuff he puts his wine into these earthenware, into the gold and silver vessels, and they go bad. So he goes and he tells her, look what happened. Amrule. They told him, right? His servants told him what had happened. He goes back to his daughter and says, Man Amralachachi, who's the person who told you this? Amrale, Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. So what does he say? Karyuhu. He calls him and he says, get the guy in front of me. Amrale, Amai Amralachachi. Said, why did you tell my daughter that? Amrale, Amrela, just like she told me, I told her. Okay, basically what he wanted to say is, right, in order to keep your wine, you have to put it in an inferior vessel. Likewise, if you want to keep your Torah, it has to be in an inferior body, which is someone ugly like me. The ha'ika shapire dignire. So the Gemara asks the obvious question, which is, well, there's some people who are actually really good looking who learn Torah, and they seem to be doing just fine. So I don't get it. So they say, snu tfei hava gemire. If they weren't so beautiful, they would actually know more. In other words, think of how great they are now. They could be even greater, because there's always, right? It's always difficult for someone who's beautiful to actually really feel that humility. And therefore, right, you really need humility to be able to learn properly. Makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you think too highly of yourself, then you're going to explain something and assume, right, you're going to read it, assume you got it in a second. And then, you're basically going to say, oh, okay, I'm done, and move on. And then you won't realize that you didn't really learn it properly. So yes, Rabbi Yochanan, as you're asking, was known to be very beautiful. And again, you have to take all of these statements in, with a grain of salt. It doesn't really mean this. They're just trying to say that you should remain humble. Okay. And that's the important part of all of this, right? That's the message. Whether this really can't be, right? The Gemara answers, they could have been even better. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan could have been even greater. It was great enough. I mean, okay. Remember also, if you think about what's the idea that you learn to accept challenges to, and Rish Lakish, remember, he was always fighting with Rish Lakish, and they were arguing, and Rish Lakish always made his Torah stronger. In the end, remember the story with him and Rish Lakish at the end of his life? He actually gets angry at Rish Lakish for disagreeing with him. Maybe that also, right? And it brought to his downfall. So in a sense, it's actually interesting that you bring up Rabbi Yochanan, because in the end, if he was more humble, he could have, right? And then he gets upset because then Rish Lakish dies, and then he can't live without Rish Lakish. He realizes how much he misses him. And anyway, we'll get to that story. Tavar achil, another reason to compare them to wine and milk and water. What does that mean? They won't get ruined if you keep focusing on them, right? If you leave them, they might spill, something might drop into them, a bug might come in. So if you keep your focus on your divrei Torah, it will remain. But if you leave it and kind of move your mind away from it, then you'll forget it. Okay, that was a whole digression into Talmidei Chachamim. Number one, about learning for the right reasons. Number two, about learning together with other people. And number three, being humble, which I think is connected to the learning with other people, right? Because if you're not humble, then you'll say, oh, I don't have anyone to learn with, and I'm just going to learn by myself. So I think those are connected. Now we're back to Gadol Yom Kshamim. So we saw Gadol Yom Kshamim, or maybe it's right greater than or equal to either Yom Shenitna Bo Torah, or the day they got the Torah, or the day of the resurrection of the dead, which will be in the future. Now, Amar Rabbi Chama bar Rabbi Chanina, Gadol Yom HaGshamim Ki Yom Shenivra'u Shamayim Va'aretz. Okay, what other day was the greatest day of the world? Is the day the world was created. And Gadol Yom Kshamim, like a day that the world was created. Okay. By the way, if you look here, there's an aleph by the word ki yom. That takes you to the Hagahot Bach, who basically makes comments on, sometimes he thinks there's a mistake in the text. Now, it says ki yom, which means it's equal to. According to the Bach, he says some other girsas say mi yom, greater than the day the world was created, which again goes back to, we don't have a machloket here in the Gemara about it, but you have a machloket in terms of what the right proper text is, what actually it's said here. Now, how do we get this? Because it says in the pasuk in Yeshayahu, "Harifu shamayim mima'al." Okay, you should drop down right from the heavens, the rain, obviously. Ushkachakim yizlu tzedek. The heavens will pour out righteousness. Okay, we're talking about not actual rain. Tiftach eretz v'yiflu yesha. The ground will open up and it will bring salvation. Utzdakat tatzmiach yachad, and righteousness will grow. Ani Hashem berativ. I am God who created this. Now, it's talking about harifu shamayim mimal. It's talking about, right, that basically the heavens came down, that the world was created. Okay, this is about creation of the world. So now, what should it say at the end of the pasuk? I am God who created these things, the shamayim and the aretz. But it doesn't say beratim, which should be I created them. It says berativ, I created it. So beratim lo ne'amar ela berativ. So they say it must be referring to the rain. In other words, this pasuk is talking about the rain and also the creation of the world. So it must be berativ, I created the rain, and then it's to say that the rain is parallel to the creation of the world. Amal Avashaya, Gadol Yom Kshamim, the day of rains are great. Sha'afilu Yeshua Perei U'Rebebo. Okay, it becomes a breeding ground for the salvation. Shneimar, as it says in this verse, Tiftach Eretz V'Yiflu Yesha. Okay, as it says in the verse, when the rain comes, right, it will sprout from their salvation. So that's the end of Gadol Yom Kshamim, like. So we saw it's like Tchiat HaMetim, it's like, or maybe greater than, it's like the world, the day the Torah was given, the day the world was created. And even, I wouldn't necessarily put this in the same category, but maybe it's a fourth, which is that salvation will come from the rains. Which, by the way, if you talk about how the rain is our connection with God, you could see why salvation will come, because it makes us feel more connected to God, which will ultimately bring the salvation. Rains will only come if, okay, so now the question is, when will the rains come? If all the sins of the people or sins of the people are forgiven. Shnema, ratzita Hashem artzecha. Okay, now we're quoting a pasuk from Tehillim. God will appease the land, which basically means bring rain. Shav tashvut Yaakov, he will return the exile of Jacob. Nasata avon amcha, he is already passed over the iniquity of the people, basically forgiven them. Kisita kol chatatam sela, right? He covered up all their sins. Basically, this means that will happen when the sins are forgiven. He says to Rabina, you learned it from there, but we learned it from a different verse. This is a pasuk from Shlomo HaMelech when he dedicates the Beit HaMikdash. We quoted a whole bunch of those pasukim in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. He says, you will listen from the skies and forgive our sins. And the next words that come are, or I don't know if it's the next pasuk, but right soon after, and then it says, Natata matar al artzecha, and you'll bring the rain. So there you see this connection between God will forgive our sins and the rains will come. Amar Rabbi Tanchum Berei de Rabbi Chia ish Kfar Akko. Okay, that's where he was from. We're now going to start to see what causes the rains not to come. Okay, number one, we saw in order for the rains to come, our sins have to be forgiven. The question is, what sins cause the rain not to come? So he says, this kind of broad statement, it's not like he's getting into particular sins. We're going to get into that in a minute. But he says, again, Sonehen Shel Yisrael is a euphemism here. It's only if the Jews are decreed to be destroyed. Okay, klaya is destruction. Shneimar, it Sia gam chom. Okay, this is a verse from Eov, which is drought and also heat. Yigzilu memeh sheleg. They're going to steal, right? The drought and the heat are going to steal the days of snow. She'ol chata'u. Those who sinned are going to go down into the depths. Here, the assumption is, right, the rain is going to stop when the people who sinned are going down to the depths, and everyone's going to be destroyed. He says, just like in the previous one, you learned it from there. We learned it from somewhere else. This is in Shema that we say every day in the second paragraph. God is going to stop the heavens. And then it says, and you're going to be wiped out very quickly, right? So here you see this connection between the rain stopping and the people being destroyed. Amar Rav Chisda. Now we're going to get into a whole list of 5 different sins that cause rains not to come. Rav Chisda says, and these are just 5 different opinions, and it could be that each one was going out against what they saw was the big issue in their day. People not giving the tithe, right? Tithing their produce and not giving it to the poor people, right? To the Levites, etc. Now, and the Kohanim. Why would this be an issue? Because it's a financial issue. People don't like to have a loss, right? Every time you bring in your produce, you have to give a certain percentage. That nobody likes to do that. So, not nobody, but you can see why people wouldn't want to do that. So, how do we get this in the verse? Same verse we just quoted. Shnema, Sia gamchom yigzilu memeh sheleg. So now the Gemara asks, my mashma, how did you get it from that verse? It wasn't very obvious. So Taanit de Rabbi Yishmael, b'shvil dvarim shetziviti etchem b'yemot hachama v'lo asitem, because of things you were supposed to do in the home, in the heat, which is when you harvest your crop in the summer, you're supposed to tithe your produce. Because of that, yigzilu memeh sheleg b'yemot hachshamim, you'll get punished in the rainy season and the rains won't come. Okay, those people who tell lashon hara, who speak badly about other people. The ruach tzafon, the north one will come and bring the rain, but panim nizamim lashon seter, you'll get angry face, meaning God will turn away and not give you rain if lashon seter, if you speak in secret, which is what lashon hara is. Usually you speak behind someone's back. So there you have it. Amar Rav Sala, Amar Rav Hamnuna. It's arrogance that causes it. Shneimar, v'yiman'u revivim u'malkosh lo haya. The revivim are the drops of rain. So v'yiman'u, they'll be prevented, and the malkosh won't come. Remember, that's the last rain. U'metzach ish zona hayalach. What is metzach ish zona hayalach? You have the arrogance of a man. Assume they mean a man who goes to a prostitute or a man who engages in prostitution, which is that you have no, and the end of that pasuk is me'ana hikalem. You refuse to be embarrassed by what you did. Okay, so that's arrogance to basically say that isha zona haya lach. Right. Sorry. It's saying you had, right. Sorry, you're right. I got confused. Metzach isha zona haya lach. You had a face, like a forehead, like in isha zona, like a prostitute who's not embarrassed at all by what she's done, and therefore you are not embarrassed by what you do. The Amar of Sala, Amar of Hamnuna, right? It's interesting they bring her as an example, right? You would think a prostitute would be embarrassed by their profession, but apparently, right? It's, again, forget about prostitutes who are forced into it and all sorts of other things where they're not to blame. But I guess talking about a prostitute who does this all on her own volition, right? She clearly has no shame about it. The Amar of Sala, Amar of Hamnuna, Kol Adam sheyesh lo azut panim, sof nichshal ba'avira. Anyone who is arrogant like that and isn't embarrassed by what they did, in the end will fall into sin. They'll be they'll sin in the future. How so? Shneimar umetzach ish zona hayalach. Okay, you're going to have again forehead of a zona. You're going to be like a zona, which is you're going to sin. So now they say, Rav Nachman Amar biyadua shenichshal b'avira. Shneimar hayalach v'lo neimar yiyelach. It doesn't say yiyelach in the future. It says you had the metzach v'nish zona. That means you must have already fallen in sin. If you're arrogant, it means you must have fallen in sin in the past. So it's debate about whether it's going to cause you to sin or it already is an indication that you already sinned. Anyone who's arrogant, mutar l'kroto rasha, you can call him a rasha. Shneimar he'ez isha rasha b'fanav. Okay, here you have he'ez azut panim, which is arrogance, and you call him an ish rasha. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Mutar, the son of Toh. Not only can you call him an evil person, but you can actually, it's permitted to hate the person. Shne'emal v'oz panim yeshuneh. Context here is actually totally, it's actually a positive verse, but they take it to say al tikre yeshuneh, which means the countenance of his face will be changed. Here they say yisna. Okay, oz panim, someone who's az panim, which is not the simple reading of the verse, but it's a drasha. Someone who's arrogant, yisaneh, will be hated. Okay, can be hated by other people. This is basically, you can see they're going very strongly against anyone who's arrogant, similar to what they were doing with the Talmidei Chachamim who were arrogant. This is just anyone who's arrogant. Amalav katina, enak shamim. Okay, next answer. So we have so far not doing truma masrot, talking lashon hara, and being arrogant. That's what rains are stopped for. Amarav Katina, Anak Shamim Ne'etzarim Ele B'Shvil Bitul Torah, when people don't learn Torah, Shene'emal, Ba'at Saltaim Yimach HaMekareh, which is the rafting will sink bit by bit, but Atzaltaim, they learn to mean B'Shvil Atzlut, laziness. Like it kind of means they'll fall in a lazy way, right? This is the rafters that are holding up your house, you're going to slowly cave in. So here it says, B'Shvil Atzlut, laziness, Shaya B'Yisrael Shelo Asku B'Torah. Why don't people learn Torah? It's just laziness. Okay, here again, we're using a euphemism. It's a euphemism for God. God will become poor. You don't want to say God will become poor. So you say those who hate God will become poor. But what does it mean God will become poor? Poor person doesn't have means to do things. So if God is poor, he can't bring the rain. So what do you see here? Because of atzlut, the people were lazy and didn't learn Torah, God will become poor and not be able to bring the rain. How do we know mach is ani? Ein mach el ani. Mach means poverty. Shneimar v'im mach hu me'erkecha. This is if you can't afford what you're supposed to bring, then this is what you should do. The Torah tells you, but anyway, mach means poor. Ve'ein, how do we know this is talking about God? Yimach ha-mekareh. Why is the mekareh God, right? The one who puts the beams up. Ein mekareh el HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shneimar ha-mekareh b'mayim aliyotav. He lays the beams in the upper chambers of the water. That's God. Rav Yosef Amar Mehacha, he gives a different verse. Va'ata lo ra'u ol, b'hilchu b'shchakim, v'ruach avra v'titaharem. Okay, the context of this is the friends of Eov, and they're saying your friends really don't know what they're talking about. Okay, they didn't see the light. It's bahiru b'shchakim, but it was there for them to see and understand. But the ruach came and basically moved it away. Okay, the way they're going to understand this pasuk is lo ra'u or ein or ela Torah. They didn't see the light of Torah. Shene'emal kiner mitzvah b'Torah ol. Bahiru b'shchakim. What does that mean? Rabbi Taanit Rabbi Yishmael, afilu b'sha'ah she'rakia na'asa behorim. You might remember from the verses in the Torah about Sarah, leprosy. It calls im baheret levana, if you have a white spot. So that the sky was spotted with white, meaning clouds. And then what happened? Right? It was behorim lo read talamatar was ready, but atal lo ra'u, or the people didn't learn Torah. So therefore, what happened? Ruach avra v'tzarim. The wind came and blew it all away. And the rains didn't come. Amar Rabbi Asi. And last one, enak shamim netzarim el bavon gezel, theft. Shneimar al kapayim kisa ol. Now, or here is going to mean something else. Bavon kapayim kisa ol. The sin they did with their hands, which is stealing. The light was covered. Ein kapayim el chamas. Kapayim means theft, robbery. Shneimar u'min chamas asher b'kapehen. The chamas that was in their hands. Okay, so there you have chamas. Ve'ein or el matal. Shneimar yafitz anan oro. The anan will, right? What happens? It scatters the light. So the or is the ananim. So what do you see? Because of kapayim, there will be no or, there'll be no rain. Which is funny because usually when it rains, it's dark. But okay. Takante. So here's the big question we're going to try to finish with, which is how do you fix it? Well, your bebe tefillah, you should do a lot of prayer. How so? How do we know this? Shneimar v'yitzav alav b'mafgia. Okay, this was the verse we read before, which was al kapayim kisa ol. So what do you do? V'yitzav alav b'mafgia, meaning you should command it to pray. Okay, the people are commanded to pray. How do we know b'mafgia is prayer? Ein pgia ela tefillah. Shneimar v'ata al tispalel ba'ad hamazeh v'al tifga bi. Yirmiyahu tells them, don't pray, al tifga bi. Don't try to beseech me for anything, okay? Because I'm not going to listen to you. That's a bad nevuah, prophecy of God saying, I don't want your prayers anymore. But the point is, tifga is to pray. Last thing for today, Amar Rabbi Ami, my dichtiv, im kehahal barzel, puhulo panim kilkal. This is a pasuk we're going to darshan a lot more tomorrow, which is if the iron is blunt, okay, it's supposed to be sharp, it's now blunt, and its surface, its edges aren't shined, aren't sharpened, Now, kilkal means sharpened and panim means edges, but panim could also mean the faces, the people, and kilkal could be from lashon mikulkal, ruined. So now they're going to explain. If the sky is like a blunt, right? What's a blunt iron? It can't do what it's supposed to do because it's supposed to be sharp. The skies aren't doing what they're supposed to do and they're not bringing rain down. Why not? It must be, this is a pasuk, by the way, in Kohelet. It's bishvil ma'aseh hadol shehem mikul kalim. It's the panim, the people that are mikul kalim. That's the reason. Okay, now, shenemar v'hu panim kilkal. Ma takanatan, so how do you fix it? Let's look at the rest of that verse. Yitgabru berachamim, shenemar v'chayalim yigaber. They should strengthen themselves in prayer because it says the next words are chayalim, which is getting people together like soldiers, will strengthen. So it means getting everyone together to pray. Yitron hechsher chokhmah. And it's even better if, okay, it will be chokhmah if it's hechsher, if they're ksherim. So what did they say here? It'll be even better and easier for them if they have good deeds to rely on that they've done in the past. So basically they're saying, pray, get together to pray if this happens. And it's even better if you have good deeds to kind of go along with your prayers, good deeds that you did in the past. We're now going to, what we'll see in tomorrow's daf is we're going to take this pasuk and darshan it in other ways about other things, not just rain. And then we'll get back to rain and prayer and how that is the resolution to all of, right, whenever rain doesn't come. Okay, have a great day, which again connects everyone back to God. That's what prayer is. Okay, with that, I'll wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and tomorrow's daf, Shabbat's daf, will go up on the site within about another hour after this one goes up, and then on Sunday we'll be back on the Zoom. Have a great Shabbat, everyone.